Caught my GF cheating with my best friend. 5 years later, she drops a bombshell before my wedding. I was 29 when everything pretty much went to hell between me, my ex-girlfriend Jane, and my old roommate and supposed friend, Ted. Jane and I had been together for a while, and it wasn't perfect, but I never thought anything shady was going on, at least not right in front of my face. Looking back, maybe there were signs, like her laughing a little too hard at his dumb jokes or hanging out in his room to watch movies on his big TV. But I brushed it off because, I trusted them. Lesson learned, I guess. One night, I got home from work and they were both acting strange. Too nice. Like they were trying too hard to pretend everything was normal. Jane was offering to make me dinner, which she never did, and Ted was asking if I wanted to go grab a burger or something. It was weird, like they were both guilty and trying to overcompensate, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. I just figured they were in good moods or something, and honestly, I was tired, so I just went with it. Then one night, the truth came out in the worst possible way. I was dead asleep when my phone buzzed with a text from a mutual friend, Kyle, at like 2 a.m. It was a screenshot of a chat where Jane was talking to one of her friends about how she and Ted had been hooking up for months. Months. My head was spinning. I wanted to believe it was some twisted joke, but I knew Kyle wouldn't lie about something like that. He just said, "Dude, I thought you should know." And that was it. I remember just staring at the screen, feeling sick. My hands were shaking, and it was like every happy moment I'd had with Jane and every late-night hangout with Ted just dissolved. I mean, this was the girl I was planning to propose to, and my friend who I'd let crash with us so he could get back on his feet. I felt like an idiot. After a few minutes, I decided to confront them. I stormed out of my room and went straight to Ted's door. I didn't even knock. I just threw it open. And there they were, sitting together on his bed, acting like two guilty kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar. The look on their faces told me everything. Jane stuttered some nonsense about how she wanted to tell me and that it just happened. Just happened? Like I was supposed to believe that kind of garbage. I felt like everything was in slow motion. There was yelling. I don't even remember half of what I said, just that I was furious. Ted tried to act tough, telling me it wasn't a big deal, because according to him, Jane and I weren't working out anyway. And Jane just sat there, looking like she was about to cry, but honestly, I didn't care. She had months to talk to me if she was that unhappy, months to end things instead of doing whatever it was they were doing. When things started calming down, well, as much as they could calm down in that situation, I told them both to get out. I didn't care where they went, I just wanted them out of my sight. Ted tried to talk to me, saying he didn't mean for things to get this far, like that somehow made it better. Meanwhile, Jane just kept saying she never wanted it to happen this way. It was all excuses, all things they thought would make me feel better, I guess. But nothing they said could fix it. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch that night, just needing to be anywhere but in that apartment. The next morning, after 0 hours of sleep, I decided it was time to leave for good. I went back to the apartment to grab my stuff, and of course, they were both still there. Jane tried to stop me from leaving, going on about how she never wanted to lose me as a friend, which is a joke because friends don't do what she did. I threw whatever I could into bags and boxes, not even bothering to pack things neatly. I just wanted out. Ted stood in the corner, avoiding eye contact like the coward he is. Finally, I was done, and I told them both that I wanted nothing to do with them ever again. Jane looked like she wanted to say something, but I didn't stick around to hear it. I just left and didn't look back. After that, I was done with them, done with the whole scene. I didn't tell our mutual friends what happened because honestly, I figured they'd find out soon enough. But here's the part that really stung. They didn't care. A few people reached out to say they were sorry for the drama, but when it came down to it, they chose to stay friends with Jane and Ted. I didn't know whether to laugh or be pissed, but it just confirmed what I needed to do. I cut them all off. Every last one. I went back to my home state, changed my number, got rid of all my social media, and basically disappeared from that entire friend group. It felt brutal at first, like I was leaving behind everything I knew, but honestly, I knew I had to do it. I was never going to move on if I kept holding on to those people who didn't have my back. So I let go of all of it, and I never looked back. Not once. It was hard, especially at first. There were days when I felt like maybe I was being too harsh or letting my anger control me, but every time I'd even think about reaching out, I'd remember that night and how they both looked at me like I was the one out of place. Like I was ruining some love story they cooked up in their heads. I mean, really? I wasn't the one sneaking around and lying to people's faces. Life wasn't perfect right after that. I went through a rough patch trying to rebuild things on my own. But slowly, I found new friends, got my career on track, and started moving up. Bit by bit, I built a life I could be proud of. And eventually, I met Ashley. She's everything Jane wasn't: honest, loyal, and yeah, actually respectful of the people in her life. She knew about my past and was cool with how things were. She respected that I'd left all that behind me and never tried to dig it back up. And with her, I actually started to feel happy again. So here I was, years after the fact, engaged to the most amazing woman I could imagine, and miles away from the drama. I thought I was free and clear, that I'd put all that baggage behind me for good. But as it turns out, I was wrong. Jane and Ted weren't finished with me just yet. All right, so I'm finally in a good place, right? After everything that happened with Jane and Ted, I put that mess behind me, cut off all ties, and moved on with my life. I was happily engaged to Ashley and honestly thought I'd close that chapter for good. But turns out that wasn't going to be the case. It all started with one simple post. I'm not a huge social media guy, but I figured, hey, why not share some good news? So I posted a picture of me and Ashley with a simple caption about our engagement. Just a quick shot of us looking happy, nothing too flashy. I figured it would get a few likes from family and the handful of friends I still keep in touch with, but that's it. Little did I know, that post was the spark that would drag all that old drama right back into my life. A couple days after I posted, I got a random message notification. I glanced at my phone, and there it was. A message from Jane. I almost dropped my phone. I mean, after years of dead silence, out of nowhere, she decides to pop back up? I didn't even open it. I just stared at her name, and all those old feelings came rushing back. The anger, the betrayal, everything. My gut reaction was just to delete it. But I sat there for a second trying to figure out why on earth she'd reach out now. I hadn't thought about her in ages, and I was happy with Ashley, so I didn't need any closure or whatever. I wasn't interested in hearing her side, her excuses, nothing. I'd made my peace a long time ago. So, without opening the message, I blocked her. Problem solved, right? Or so I thought. I told Ashley about it that night. I didn't want any secrets between us, especially with something that felt like a weird blast from the past. She just laughed it off and said I did the right thing. Just in case, she blocked Jane too. We both figured that would be the end of it. Jane got her closure or whatever and could move on too. But then, the fake profiles started popping up. At first I didn't notice because, like I said, I'm not big on social media. But Ashley was getting weird friend requests from random accounts with 0 posts and some generic profile pic. She's smart though, so she didn't accept any of them. After a few, she started suspecting it might be Jane, and I couldn't help but agree. I mean, who else would be that persistent? It was honestly just annoying more than anything. I hadn't thought about Jane in so long, and now here she was playing games and trying to get my attention like we were still in high school. Eventually, I just decided to delete my social media entirely. No point keeping it around if it was just going to be used as a way for her to poke at me. I figured if I wasn't online, she'd have no choice but to drop it. Before I deleted my account, I sent a quick message from one of her fake profiles that had finally messaged me directly. I told her to leave me alone and that I wanted nothing to do with her. I didn't even give her time to respond. I hit send and blocked her right after. Then I wiped the whole account. Finally done, right? I figured she'd get the hint and move on with her life. But no, not even close. Apparently, when I shut down my accounts, Jane decided to go around me entirely. A couple days later, my sister Mandy called me up out of the blue. Now, Mandy and I are close, but we don't usually talk every day. So I figured she was just calling to chat or ask about the engagement plans. But she sounded serious, and I could tell something was up. I didn't even get a chance to say hello before she just went, "Hey, I need to talk to you about something weird." I'm thinking, great, what now? She starts telling me how Jane had reached out to her, and not just a casual, "Hey, how's it going?" message. Jane apparently went straight into some bizarre story claiming I had a son. Yeah, you read that right, a son. At first I laughed. I mean, it was ridiculous. I told Mandy, she's probably just trying to get attention or something. But Mandy wasn't laughing. She said Jane was serious and sounded pretty desperate. Mandy had even tried to brush her off, but Jane was persistent. She'd sent her pictures of this kid, saying how much he looked like me, talking about how she never wanted to keep this a secret, blah blah blah. I didn't buy it. The way I saw it, this was just Jane's last-ditch effort to get my attention. I mean, if this was true, she had years to come forward. If this kid was mine, wouldn't she have tried to contact me about child support, or at least told me when she found out she was pregnant? It made no sense to me, and I told Mandy as much. But Mandy said Jane seemed pretty insistent. I could tell Mandy wasn't sure what to believe either, which only made it weirder. The whole thing messed with my head. I tried to brush it off as another one of Jane's lies, but a part of me was stuck on the what if? Like, what if she was actually telling the truth? The timing seemed way too convenient, and I wasn't exactly in the mood to believe anything that came out of her mouth, but the idea of having a kid out there. It's not something you can just ignore. For the next few days, I couldn't focus. I'd be at work, and my mind would wander back to Jane and this supposed son. Ashley noticed I was acting off, and she kept asking me if I was okay. I didn't want to drag her into the mess, so I just said I was dealing with some work stress. But in reality, my mind was all over the place. The thought of a kid, my kid, possibly being out there, it didn't sit right. Finally, I decided I couldn't just ignore it. I wanted to make sure Jane didn't somehow show up at our door next. I had to put an end to this once and for all, one way or another. So I called up a lawyer. I didn't want to deal with her directly, but I figured a lawyer could send a letter, something official to tell her to back off. I just wanted her out of my life. No more games, no more drama. I was moving forward with Ashley, and I didn't need my past dragging me back. I explained everything to the lawyer, all the messages, the fake profiles, and finally, the "I have a son" message. He listened and nodded, saying he'd take care of it. He said he'd send her a letter asking her to provide proof if she was serious, otherwise to leave me alone. It was a relief to hand it off to someone else. I didn't want to deal with Jane myself, and having a lawyer on it made me feel like this was finally going to be handled. With the lawyer involved, I thought this would finally be over. So, I got the lawyer involved, and I felt like a weight was finally off my shoulders. I was done with Jane's nonsense, or at least I thought I was. I figured she'd get the letter, and that would be enough to make her back off. But just a few days later, the lawyer calls me up, saying he needs to see me in person to discuss the situation. I figured he was just going to tell me Jane backed off, so I walked into his office feeling pretty relaxed. He sat me down, didn't say much at first, just handed me an envelope. Inside were pictures, several of them, of a little boy. And I don't know how else to say it, but the kid looked exactly like me. It was eerie, like looking at an old picture of myself when I was younger. Same dark hair, same eyes, even a similar smile. I just sat there staring, feeling a mix of anger and confusion. My lawyer explained that Jane sent him these pictures as proof, along with a note explaining the timeline. According to her, she got pregnant not long after I caught her and Ted together, but she and Ted both assumed the baby was his. She claimed they didn't say anything to me because, they thought Ted was the father and just went on with their lives. It wasn't until later, when they tried to have more kids, that they found out Ted was sterile. Apparently, that's when the doubts started creeping in for them. I'll be honest, part of me still thought this was some elaborate ploy. I mean, Jane had never exactly been trustworthy, and it just seemed too convenient. But the photos? They were hard to argue with. The kid had features that were just mine. Still, I wasn't going to take her word for it without real proof, so I told my lawyer to get a DNA test arranged. I needed something concrete before I even started to process what was happening. Waiting for those results was brutal. Every day felt like a week, and I could barely focus on anything else. I told Ashley what was going on because I didn't want to keep her in the dark, and she was supportive, but I could tell she was worried. I mean, this wasn't just some random drama. If this kid was mine, it was going to change everything. She stuck by me, though, reassuring me that whatever happened, we'd handle it together. After what felt like forever, the results finally came in. My lawyer called me and said, "It's a match." I didn't know what to feel. Relief? Shock? Anger? Maybe a mix of all of it. Here I was, just finding out I had a son I'd never known about. A son who'd been raised thinking Ted was his father, who had no idea who I was. It's one thing to find out you're a dad. It's another to realize you've missed the first 5 years of your kid's life because someone kept it from you. My head was spinning. I tried to wrap my mind around the fact that this little boy was mine, that I had a son. But then, almost immediately, my thoughts went to Ted. How had he gone along with all this, raising my kid as his own, while knowing there was a chance it wasn't his? And Jane, she'd had years to come clean, years to at least give me a heads up, but instead she kept it buried, only coming forward now that she saw I was doing well. It was impossible not to feel used. Like, she'd only reached out because suddenly, my life looked good on paper. It wasn't about me, and it definitely wasn't about the kid. She just saw an opportunity and decided to jump on it. That realization was like a punch to the gut, and it only fueled my anger. But at the same time, I had to think about my son, about what this meant for him. He didn't ask to be brought into this mess, and I wasn't going to abandon him just because his mom and dad had lied to me. I told my lawyer to get in touch with Jane and Ted and tell them that, yes, I would be involved in my son's life. I wanted visitation rights, and I was more than willing to pay child support. I wasn't going to let them dictate terms anymore, especially after everything they'd hidden. But as soon as my lawyer mentioned visitation, Ted lost it. From what my lawyer told me, Ted insisted he was the kid's real dad and didn't want me around his son. I mean, talk about audacity. The guy cheats with my girlfriend, raises my son without saying a word to me, and now wants to pretend I don't exist. I was fuming. I told my lawyer to tell Ted that if I'm paying child support, I'm not just some random check in the mail. I was going to be a part of my son's life, whether he liked it or not. Of course, Jane jumped in, trying to smooth things over. She suggested we could work something out where I'd pay, but maybe visitation could be discreet to avoid confusing the kid. I wasn't having it. If they wanted money, they'd better be prepared to let me be there as his father, plain and simple. And if they refused, I'd start a savings account for my son and let him access it when he turned 18. But I wasn't going to play along with whatever twisted setup they had in mind. The whole situation felt surreal. Here I was, ready to be a dad, something I never thought I'd have to think about so soon, and all I got was pushback. I couldn't understand their logic. They wanted my money but didn't want me involved? It felt like they were trying to pick and choose the parts of me they wanted in their lives, as if I was just some wallet they could call up when it suited them. I wasn't about to stand for it. I decided to push harder. I told my lawyer to make it clear that if I was going to pay child support, I'd pursue full visitation rights or whatever rights I was entitled to as his biological father. I wasn't going to let them turn me into some background character in my son's life. And if they didn't agree, then they'd get nothing from me financially. I'd rather save up for my son's future than let them control this situation. Jane and Ted threw every guilt trip in the book, calling me selfish and saying I was just trying to ruin their family. It's honestly ridiculous coming from the two people who hid a whole kid from me. Selfish? If anything, they were the selfish ones, pretending they were this picture-perfect family while knowing the truth the whole time. So here I am, ready to fight for my son. I don't know how this will play out, but I know one thing. I'm not letting them push me out of his life. They may have kept him from me for 5 years, but I'll be damned if I let them keep him from me any longer. After telling my lawyer I was in for the long haul, we got serious about what I could actually do here. I mean, legally, it's not as straightforward as you'd think. Jane and Ted had a head start, 5 whole years, and because Ted was on the birth certificate, he was considered the legal dad. My lawyer explained that in situations like this, even though I'm biologically the father, it's not a simple matter to just step in and get full rights. It was going to take time, money, and, well, a lot of patience. And patience? Not exactly my strong suit. Jane and Ted didn't make it easy either. My lawyer reached out to set up a meeting to discuss visitation, but Ted refused to even sit down. He sent a long, dramatic email about how he's the only dad my son has ever known, and he didn't want to disrupt the kid's life by letting me into it. He actually used the word disrupt, like my son was some project he was working on and didn't want me to mess up. This guy. Meanwhile, Jane kept trying to negotiate some sort of weird middle ground. She suggested I could visit my son, but only if it was on her terms. She wanted me to agree to see him maybe once every few months, preferably with Ted not around. Apparently, the idea was to keep things low-key so the kid wouldn't feel confused about who his dad was. But here's the thing. I am his dad, biologically and morally. I wasn't going to let them just shove me into some hidden side role in my own kid's life. I told my lawyer that their terms were unacceptable. Either they let me into his life as his father, or I wasn't going to give them a dime. They couldn't have it both ways, no matter how much they tried to make it sound reasonable. And, predictably, they flipped out. Jane was suddenly sending emails filled with guilt trips, stuff about how I was hurting my son by refusing to contribute financially. Ted, on the other hand, was going full territorial, sending messages saying I was only around because I didn't want my past mistakes to haunt me. Mistakes? My son wasn't a mistake. If anything, the only mistake here was trusting either of them in the first place. So, my lawyer went back and forth with them for weeks. At this point, the emails were a mix of attempts to shame me, guilt me, and persuade me to just give up. But every time I'd sit there and think about my son. He didn't know me yet, but I wanted to make sure that when he was old enough, he'd know I fought to be in his life. I wasn't just going to write checks and stand by while some other guy played the role that should have been mine. Finally, after what felt like ages, we managed to get them to agree to a sit-down meeting. It was awkward as hell. Jane showed up first, looking tense, like she was about to face some corporate board or something. Ted walked in a few minutes later, didn't look at me once, just sat down and crossed his arms like he was doing some sort of silent protest. The energy in that room was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Jane started talking, going on about how she'd only kept this a secret because she thought it was for the best. For the best? I asked her, barely able to keep my voice steady. How was keeping a kid from his father for 5 years for the best? She stammered through some excuse about thinking Ted was his dad and how she didn't want to complicate things by bringing me into it. Then Ted chimed in, finally deciding to speak, and he was in full-on defensive mode. I raised him. I taught him to ride his bike. I've been there for every scraped knee, every school project, he said, like I was some intruder trying to steal his kid. The thing is, I get it. He's been there. He's done the dad stuff. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm the biological father, and I deserve the chance to be there too. We argued for hours, back and forth, until it felt like we were just repeating ourselves. They kept circling back to the idea of what's best for him, but what they really meant was what's best for us. They wanted me in the background, out of sight, just the bank account they could tap into whenever they wanted. They kept throwing in lines like, well, we don't want to confuse him, but the kid's 5 years old. He's going to get curious about me eventually. How long did they plan on keeping this up? Finally, my lawyer stepped in, laying out our terms clearly. If they wanted child support, then I'd have to be allowed regular visitation, plain and simple. Ted looked like he was ready to explode, but I wasn't backing down. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about my son and my right to be in his life. I wasn't going to stand for being treated like a third wheel in a situation where I was literally his father. Jane tried one last play, saying maybe we could revisit the idea in a year or two once my son was more used to things. But I was done compromising. I told him that if I didn't get fair visitation, I'd start a savings account for him instead. He'd have that money waiting for him when he turned 18, and he'd know that I tried to be there. I wasn't going to just fund their family while they pretended I didn't exist. When I said that, Jane's face fell. I could tell she hadn't expected me to be so firm. Maybe she thought I'd fold and just pay up to avoid the hassle. But that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to be some distant ghost in my son's life just because it was more convenient for them. I wanted him to know me, to know that I was there, and that I cared enough to fight for him. The meeting ended with no real resolution, and it was frustrating to say the least. But I left feeling like I'd made my stance clear. They knew I wasn't just going to disappear into the background, no matter how much they wanted that. And if they wanted my financial support, they were going to have to give a little too. As I walked out of that room, I felt this mix of anger and sadness. Anger because of everything they put me through, and sadness because, in a twisted way, Ted was right. He'd been there for those years that I couldn't be, and nothing I did would change that. But that didn't mean I was going to give up. I was going to be in my son's life, whether they liked it or not. Walking out of that tense meeting, I felt drained but determined. It was clear by then that Jane and Ted would make this as difficult as possible, but I knew I couldn't just walk away from my son. The stakes were too high, and I wasn't about to let them decide my involvement on their terms. But honestly, the frustration was eating at me. It felt like every step forward got blocked by their stubbornness. A couple of weeks went by, and things went mostly quiet. My lawyer and I were still working on getting visitation rights officially lined up, and I was prepared to go to court if that's what it took. I didn't care about the hassle anymore. I just wanted to be there for my son. But then Jane tried another tactic, a message this time, without any legal stuff involved. She sent it directly to me, bypassing my lawyer, which caught me off guard. It was like she was trying to appeal to me personally, hoping to find some common ground, or maybe convince me to change my stance. Her message started out friendly, which threw me. She said something along the lines of, "I've been thinking about things, and I realize this has all been hard on you too." She went on about how she didn't intend to hurt me back then, and that, in some twisted way, she thought she was doing what was best for our son. She added that Ted was still having a hard time accepting the situation and felt threatened by me suddenly being in the picture. I'll admit, part of me wondered if she was genuinely trying to make things right, but the other part of me knew better. It wasn't like she suddenly developed a conscience overnight. She'd hidden my son from me for years, let Ted play dad, and only came clean when it was convenient for her. Her message felt more like another angle she was working than an actual apology. Still, I kept reading, wanting to see where she was going with it. Then she dropped what I think was her real point. She suggested a compromise. She said she could see me having a relationship with our son, but only if I agreed to limit it to a few visits a year and avoid telling him the truth about who I was. She called it a chance to keep things peaceful for everyone. She painted it like she was doing me a favor, offering me this tiny role in my own son's life while keeping Ted as the main figure. At that moment, any thought I'd had about giving her the benefit of the doubt went straight out the window. A few visits a year and some silent role? I wasn't about to be a glorified uncle in my own son's life. If she thought I'd be okay with that, she clearly didn't know me at all. I fired back a message that was short and direct. If I'm paying child support, I'm his dad. Period. Take it or leave it. She didn't reply, and I figured that was the end of that conversation. A couple more days went by, and just when I thought things were cooling off, Ted called. This was the first time I'd actually heard his voice in years, and to be honest, it sent a rush of anger through me. But I forced myself to stay calm and let him speak. He started by saying he wanted to clear the air, and that he thought we could find a way to work this out like adults. I had my doubts, but I kept listening. He admitted that he'd struggled with the whole situation, and that he was trying to come to terms with it. He even threw in some comments about how he respected that I wanted to step up and be involved. But then he got to the real point. He said he was afraid that my involvement would confuse our son, that it might make him feel like he had two dads, which, according to Ted, wasn't healthy for a kid his age. I'll be real. He almost had me with the "let's work this out like adults" angle. But the more he talked, the more it became clear he was just trying to get me to back off. He wasn't interested in finding common ground. He was interested in keeping things exactly how he wanted them, with me in the background. I cut him off mid-sentence and told him straight up, if I'm going to be paying, I'm going to be a part of his life. I'm not here to make things easy for you or for Jane. This is about my son. Ted tried to jump back in, saying something about how I was ruining a family, but I wasn't having it. I hung up, feeling like that was probably the last time we'd be able to have a civil conversation, if you could even call it that. After that, everything went quiet again. But I knew that the next steps were going to be legal. It felt like a weird calm before the storm, where I just focused on preparing for whatever fight they'd throw at me next. But I wasn't backing down. I was going to be a real father to my son, not some occasional visitor or ghostly figure in his life. In the meantime, Ashley was my rock. She kept me grounded and reminded me that I was doing the right thing, even when I felt like the whole world was against me. She was there through every update, every frustrating conversation, every new tactic Jane and Ted tried. I couldn't have gotten through it without her. One night, as we were talking about the future, Ashley said something that really stuck with me. She said, "Your son deserves to know the real you, and he'll thank you one day for fighting to be there." It was exactly what I needed to hear. This wasn't about revenge or getting back at Jane and Ted. It was about my son and making sure he knew that his real dad cared enough to stand up for him. So here I am, still fighting, still waiting for the legal process to play out. I don't know how long it'll take or what obstacles they'll throw at me next, but I know I'm not going to stop. One day my son will know the truth, and he'll know that I did everything I could to be in his life. It's been a rough journey, but I wouldn't change a thing, because at the end of the day, he's worth it. Last update. After months of back and forths, court dates, and more frustration than I can even put into words, we finally reached a settlement. I'd get regular visitation rights, scheduled times where I could be with my son, without Jane and Ted's rules hanging over my head. It wasn't the perfect outcome I wanted. I wanted to be his dad in every way, but given the circumstances, it was something. The first visit felt surreal. I remember standing outside the park where we'd agreed to meet, my heart pounding like I was meeting him for the first time. And in a way, I was. When he ran over to me, there was this moment where it felt like everything just clicked. I saw myself in him, the same curious look, the same wild energy. I don't think I stopped smiling the entire time. We played, talked, and laughed, and he showed me all the things he loved, just like any regular kid. And for that hour or two, it felt like I was a part of his life, like I was his dad. It's not easy. I still have to see Jane and Ted, still deal with the boundaries they put up, and sometimes I leave feeling like I've barely scratched the surface of knowing him. But each visit, I feel like he's opening up to me a little more. I'm not just some stranger anymore. I'm his dad, and he knows it, even if he doesn't fully understand it yet. And as for Jane and Ted, they're doing their own thing. I think they're finally starting to accept that I'm not going anywhere, that I'm a permanent part of this kid's life, whether they like it or not. They don't have to like it, but they respect it, and that's good enough for now. Ashley's been my rock through all of this. She's gotten to know my son too, and seeing her with him has only made me more certain that she's the one. We're planning our wedding, and while I can't be the dad to him full-time yet, I've got this dream of one day having him there by my side, maybe as my best man when he's older, standing next to me as a real part of my family. It's not a fairy tale ending. I won't ever get those first 5 years back. But every visit, every laugh, every time he calls me dad, even in his own little way, it makes the whole fight worth it. And maybe one day when he's old enough, I'll tell him the whole story. Not to make him pick sides, but so he knows that from the very start, I fought to be there. And I'll keep showing up, for as long as he'll have me.